Morris and Guinness perceived Protestantism as a return to primitive Christianity, which it was in part. However, from a 21st century perspective looking back, it appears more of a large splinter from Catholicism. The Catholic Church was not always blatantly apostate. There was an early period well before Boniface VIII when its beliefs and practices for the most part were acceptably Christian in an Augustinian Protestant way. That is the stage of the Catholic Church that Protestantism more likely returned to. Meanwhile, an ecclesia apart from institutions, movements, and polity has always existed on earth, neither Catholic nor Protestant. It is a church faithful and authentic to Scripture, void of polity and untainted by Caesars, popes, governments, and politics. It is the church of which Jesus said, "The gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Protestantism, on the other hand, emerged from Catholicism. It is the daughter of the whore spoken of in Revelation 17 verse 5, Mystery Babylon, the mother of harlots and abominations. It was not built on the foundation of Jesus Christ and the apostles. It cannot claim that lineage. Rather, it was a movement that recognized the errors of Catholicism and first wanted to fix them. However, realizing that was not possible, it broke away. It did not remove itself entirely from Catholicism, but carried with it many trappings of its Babylonian mother. We see the plain evidence of this in Protestant churches, where a Romish hierarchical church model is extant, and traditions of the Catholic Church are practiced. For example, the Anglican Church exhibited, and still does, much of the superficiality of Catholicism, a hierarchical priesthood, ritualism, and infant baptism, set in worship that is steeped in pomp and ceremony. Yet that church cannot be considered formally Roman Catholic in the most essential ways. For example, it replaced the Pope as the infallible authority on earth with Scripture as that infallible authority, and it insisted on salvation by faith and faith alone. Additionally, it denied purgatory, indulgences, idols, Mariology, and numerous other false doctrines central to Catholicism. Similarly, in Germany, the Lutheran Church emerged from Catholicism, carrying with it many of Rome's characteristics, but denying essential errors of Rome, much like the Anglican Church. Protestantism by necessity was not only a spiritual reformation, but a political reformation. It had little choice but to deny the papacy's temporal authority. However, that required its replacement with the polity of Protestantism. This is clearly evidenced in Britain, where the King of England assumed the title, Defender of the Faith, and in other countries where political leaders identified their polity and religion as Protestant. Protestantism, to survive, needed to counter Catholicism, to offer a viable alternative. Regretfully, it found it unnecessary to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and therefore it adopted the same essential Romish hierarchical understanding of truth, while applying certain Protestant values of conscience and liberty to both religion and matters of state. Rome's essential hierarchical framework was never really changed within emerging Protestantism. What Protestantism changed were certain rules governing that framework. Those rules pertaining to the Christian religion were primarily expressed in thesis and doctrinal statements that in certain ways distinguished Protestantism from Catholicism. And in the case of government, the United States of America in particular, a document underscored with Protestant biblical understanding of a nation under God. Thus, Protestantism presented itself as a religious alternative to Catholicism and a viable political model to replace papal government. Protestantism's role in breaking the yoke of Rome and spreading the gospel of salvation by faith and faith alone is undeniable. It was a movement mightily used by God both spiritually and politically. Heads of state, kings and presidents, preachers and theologians, churches and universities identified with Protestantism and governed themselves with its principles. Worldwide social infrastructures were developed, then multiplied in support of freedoms Protestantism brought with it. And eventually the United States of America emerged the crowning glory of Protestant ideology. Yet Protestantism and the Reformation remained the enemy of Roman Catholicism, and from day one declared itself so by relentlessly preaching that the Roman Catholic Church was the Antichrist system, and its popes were the Antichrists spoken of by Bible prophets. More than anyone, Rome was aware of the polemic that existed between itself and Protestantism, and it identified the Achilles heel of that polemic, namely, authority. Roman Catholic religion and polity had the Pope as its infallible, inerrant authority, while Protestantism had the King James Bible as its infallible, inerrant authority. Thus, superficially, Rome's challenge was simple. Destroy Protestantism's authority, and like a ship without an anchor and a rudder, it will drift where the tide and wind takes it. At that point, Rome need only bring Protestantism back into the harbor of Roman Catholicism. Thus, in the early 16th century, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, was formed, a self-proclaimed military order that embraced all that Roman Catholicism stood for spiritually and politically. And employing every principle and doctrine of Romanism, it undertook to bring Protestantism back under the authority of Rome. Jesuitism is the heart and soul of Roman Catholic counter-reformation. Though Jesuitism, the Society of Jesus, was officially established in 1541, it was not a new idea introduced into the Catholic Church. Rather, it was a consolidation of the essence of Romanism, and it took seriously the magnitude of the implications of hundreds of years of papal bulls and a magisterium that built the house of papal infallibility. This order of Loyola was and is the consummate spiritual and temporal expression of a Catholicism that every Catholic from the bottom of the pyramid up, consciously or unconsciously, embraces by their very declaration of faith in the Roman Catholic religious institution. Being a Catholic in every sense of that religion and believing its claims means agreeing with everything that Ignatius Loyola identified as Catholic. And that starts with understanding and accepting the totality of papal infallibility and one's requirement for unwavering submission to it. Thus, Loyola's spiritual exercises, a diabolical system if practiced to its fullest extent, is designed to divest one of conscience, self-will, moral constraints, materialism, and self-preservation. It is a mystical spiritual method that, when perfectly accomplished, leaves behind it a mere shell of a person, an empty vessel to be filled with the will and conscience of another spiritual power, presumably God on earth, the Pope of Rome. That is Catholicism's true expectation of every human being claiming to be a Roman Catholic, and even those not identifying with Rome. Fundamentally, Roman Catholicism cares little about your brand of religion, as long as you unconditionally submit your will and conscience to the Roman Pontiff. This is the true essence of ecumenism, and a primary objective of its champions, the Jesuits. Why is Jesuitism so important? Firstly, it should be noted that Jesuitism does not necessarily seek to demolish the religious and political edifice that calls itself Protestant. That structure is fine, essentially Romish in appearance. Rather, Jesuitism is a separator. It recognizes, and always has, that most Protestants, Baptists included, are Protestants by convenience and not by conviction. And if pushed hard enough in the right ways, they will abandon core Protestant values, declaring that the price of Protestantism is too high. Jesus refers to such Christians as seeds that fell on stony ground. They had no root and withered up and died when confronted with extreme conditions. It is the primary function of the Jesuits, particularly those at high levels, to crank up the heat, to create circumstances within Protestant religion and polity that force self-proclaimed Christians to prove their faith, to take a stand in the face of dire consequences. In countries like the United States, there has been no testing of the faith, no real persecution. Without it, it is nearly impossible to identify truly born-again Christians. In contrast, identifying oneself as a Christian during the 1st century AD was no light decision. It guaranteed torture and often death. Today it is common for people to casually call themselves Christians, not having been forced to count the cost. Yet Roman Catholicism has no real desire to persecute its own, though it will if that serves its purpose. Rather, it seeks to isolate truly born-again believers and wipe them off the face of the earth. But first, they need to be identified and tagged for extermination. It is highly unlikely that nominal Christians are prepared to pay the high price of unwavering Christian commitment. Secondly, the usefulness or function of the Jesuits is twofold. It will, on one level, accomplish certain objectives of Antichrist. But like the relationship between ancient Babylon and Israel, God will use the Jesuits to purify His church, to separate the wheat from the chaff. One need only study Old Testament Israel to see how God time and again allowed Israel to be invaded by wicked foreign nations. Each time God used those nations as agents of judgment upon apostate Israel. Similarly, today's Protestant and Baptist churches can expect judgment. 1 Peter 4:17 says, quote, "For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall be the end of them that obey not the gospel?" Unquote. Thus, America will one day realize that God's church is not Protestant, nor is it Baptist per se, but is made up of saved believers, called out and separated. That is the ecclesia of the New Testament. Some followers of Christ are still found in denominational and quasi-denominational churches. They must come out, as Revelation says, quote, "Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues." Unquote. How have the Jesuits been prepared for the task of separating those who belong to Jesus Christ and those who belong to the Vicar of Christ? While being mentally reconditioned through Loyola's spiritual exercises, they are trained and educated to occupy every level of society from top to bottom. This includes corporate heads, high-level politicians, legal authorities, academics, both administrative and professional, scientists, medical professionals, theologians, pastors, priests, school teachers, white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, and entertainers. It is through infiltration of society that Vatican agents are able to identify opposition to Rome. Whenever highly trained Jesuits are not available or found unsuitable for these roles, coadjutors and lower-level friends of Jesuits and Catholic laity are exploited. All are expendable if their usefulness runs out. Thus, the Jesuits use every means possible to accomplish their objectives. Yet, in the end, it's all for naught. God is the ruler over all, and His will be done. Paul reminds us of that in Romans 8:28. He writes, quote, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to His purpose." Unquote. For a time, the last days apostate church will include Protestants, Baptists, and Catholics. Because Protestants and Baptists mimic Catholicism's hierarchy, corporate structure, and polity, it is simply a matter of time before persecution forces them to shed all pretenses of opposition to Rome.